The problem with humans, Vec Olar had always said, was that they were impossible to read. Vec Olar was a senior toxicologist aboard the Galactic Confederation research vessel Sovereign Pale, and he had spent 43 rotations studying biological responses to chemical agents across 211 species. He had once watched a Threlian warrior dissolve from the inside after a single drop of Moravian acid touched its tongue. He had documented the death of a Quora elder who simply ceased breathing upon smelling a compound Vec Olar had synthesized from common swamp minerals. He was, by any galactic standard, very good at his job. And yet the human sitting across the dining table from him was currently spooning a second helping of Qatari stew into his bowl, humming quietly to himself, completely unbothered by the fact that his food contained enough 157 by compound to liquidate the organs of a Brellian ox. His name was Dorian Visek. Vec Olar's secondary eyes twitched. His pen hovered motionless above his observation tablet. "This is good," Dorian said, not looking up. "What is this flavor? Is this like cinnamon?" "No, something stronger than cinnamon. Earthy, like cinnamon got in a fight with pepper and neither of them won." Ambassador Turasol, seated at the head of the long silver table, exchanged a look with Vec Olar. Her 4 fingers curled slightly around her water vessel. She said nothing. Dorian tapped his spoon twice against the edge of the bowl and took another bite. Vec Olar made a small sound in the back of his throat, something between a cough and a prayer. "Let me go back. Let me explain exactly how this situation came to exist, because it did not happen by accident, and it was not the product of incompetence. It was in fact the most carefully designed assassination attempt the Galactic Confederation's Division of Interspecies Discretion had ever sanctioned, which made what was currently happening all the more insulting." Dorian Vasek was 31 years old by Earth solar counting. He stood at approximately 1.8 meters, had brown hair, brown eyes, a scar above his left eyebrow that he had never once explained, and the kind of relaxed posture that made experienced soldiers uncomfortable. He was technically classified as a cultural integration specialist, which was the Confederation's polite way of saying he was the human they sent when other humans could not be trusted to behave. He had been stationed aboard the Sovereign Pale for 6 weeks, serving as a liaison between the Confederation's diplomatic corps and Earth's newly ratified observer delegation. Nobody had wanted him there. That was the first thing. Ambassador Turasol had specifically requested a different human. One of the quieter ones, the kind that sat in corners during banquets and nodded politely, and never asked follow-up questions. Instead, they had sent Dorian, who asked follow-up questions about the follow-up questions, who had once spent 40 minutes interrogating a Confederation cook about the molecular bonding structure of their bread, and who had, on his 3rd day aboard, cheerfully informed the ship's chief navigator that her star charts were slightly off in the Kelros drift zone. "But don't worry, I marked the corrections in pencil." The navigator had not appreciated this. Neither had anyone else. The Confederation, in its long and distinguished history, had absorbed, subdued, or diplomatically annihilated over 600 species. It had done so through a combination of superior technology, calculated patience, and when necessary, targeted removal of inconvenient individuals. Earth's observer status was already a source of significant internal debate. Many within the High Council believed the humans had been elevated too quickly. They were loud, they were unpredictable, they reproduced at an uncomfortable rate, and seemed constitutionally incapable of staying in the places they were assigned to. Dorian Vasek, specifically, had become a problem. In 6 weeks he had corrected 3 senior officers in open meetings, and been proven right each time. Somehow befriended the entire maintenance crew through a combination of card games and what the crew described as extremely funny stories about Earth disasters, discovered and casually mentioned a minor data irregularity in the ship's fuel allocation logs that later revealed a mid-level embezzlement scheme involving 2 council liaisons, and had, most recently, submitted a 40-page personal memo to Ambassador Turasol, suggesting that the Confederation's standard diplomatic framework was a little rigid, and offering a revised version he had apparently written on a rest period. The memo was annoyingly well-reasoned. It was decided after a private meeting that involved considerably less shouting than the previous private meetings that Dorian Vasek needed to be removed from the equation. Not out of malice, the council members told each other, out of necessity. Earth was not yet a full member. The observer protocol had no protection clauses for individual liaisons, and if the human simply became ill during his tenure aboard, well, these things happened. The 157-day compound was Vec Olar's idea. It was not a crude poison. He wanted that to be understood. It was a masterwork, a molecule with a delayed activation sequence, designed to pass through initial biological screening as an inert flavor compound, then bind to cellular membranes over a period of 4 to 6 hours, causing a systemic failure that would present to any medical examiner unfamiliar with the compound as a simple allergic response to unfamiliar alien cuisine. 157 times the lethal dose for most known organic species, hence 157 Bex. Vek Olar had named it himself. He had administered it personally, adding it to the Qatari stew during preparation, wearing 3 layers of protective shielding just to be safe. The compound had no scent detectable to alien olfactory systems. It had a faint, sharp undertone that registered to some species as a mild warming spice. Dorian had described it as cinnamon that lost a fight with pepper. He had now finished his second bowl. "Is there more?" he asked, already reaching for the serving ladle. Vekolar's pen snapped in his grip. "The serving vessel is limited tonight," Ambassador Turasol said, with remarkable composure for someone watching a walking biological violation eat lethal poison like it was soup at a family dinner. "Oh." Dorian looked mildly disappointed. He set down the ladle. "Fair enough. That was really good, though. What was the base broth?" It had that mineral quality to it, almost metallic, but smooth, like if iron decided to be pleasant. Vekolar stared at him. "Is there a recipe?" Dorian asked. "I will. Have the chef send you the preparation notes," Turasol said. "Fantastic." Dorian leaned back in his chair, folded his hands behind his head, and smiled at the ceiling in the easy, untroubled way of a man who believed the universe was, fundamentally, a place that wished him well. Vekolar excused himself. He walked to his laboratory with the measured, dignified stride of a professional, sealed the door behind him, and then stood very still for approximately 3 minutes, recalculating everything he thought he knew about biology. The 157-DI compound had a confirmed lethality rate of 100% across every tested species. Dorian Vasek had eaten 2 bowls, and asked for the recipe. Vekolar pulled up his observation tablet and began, with slightly trembling hands, to write his notes. Subject consumed full dose at primary serving. Then requested and consumed secondary serving. Subject displayed no physiological distress, no dermal flushing, no respiratory irregularity, no motor degradation. Subject described taste as, quote, "like cinnamon that lost a fight with pepper." Subject requested recipe. He stared at what he had written. He deleted the last line and wrote it again because he could not quite accept it. He added, "Recommend immediate follow-up study. Recommend elevated containment protocols. Recommend speaking to someone with higher clearance than myself." Then he added, "Do not under any circumstances let the human near the ship's kitchen again." He sent the report. Then he sat down on the floor of his laboratory, which was undignified but which he felt was warranted under the circumstances. 3 corridors away, Dorian Vasek was brushing his teeth, thinking about the stew. It really had been good. There was something about the flavor that nagged at the back of his mind. Not unpleasantly. More like the way a song stays with you after you have already forgotten the words. He spat, rinsed and examined himself in the polished reflective panel above the hygiene station. He looked fine. He felt fine. His joints ached a little, but they always ached a little. An old injury from his 3rd year in Earth's voluntary exploration program had left his right shoulder with a permanent mild complaint, and he had learned to treat it as a conversational companion rather than a problem. He stretched, changed into his sleep clothes, and sat on the edge of his bunk with his personal log. "Day 43, he said quietly. "Dinner with the ambassador tonight. Good stew. Interesting spice profile, couldn't quite place it. The ambassador seemed tense, but she always seems tense around me, so probably not significant." Vekolar looked like he was going to pass out at one point. "I should probably ask him if he is feeling all right in the morning. These Confederation types don't seem great at admitting when they're unwell." He paused. "I submitted my revised diplomatic framework memo last week. No response yet. Starting to think she didn't love it. Which is a shame, because I think the part about graduated consensus thresholds was genuinely useful. I might bring it up again." He set down the log, otherwise quiet. "The maintenance crew beat me at cards for the first time tonight. They were very pleased about it. I let them win 1 hand, but the rest was legitimate, and I think they know it, which made them more pleased, somehow. Good people." He lay back. Still can't place that spice. He was asleep within minutes. In the medical monitoring station on the ship's lower deck, a single passive bioscan unit registered Dorian Vex's vital signs as he slept. Heart rate 58 beats per standard minute. Respiratory rate calm and even. Cellular activity normal. Core temperature 37.1 degrees, precisely within human baseline parameters. Truckweave 57 bikes compound, according to every model Vekolar had ever built, should have been binding to cellular membranes within 90 minutes of consumption. At the 2-hour mark, systemic distress indicators should have begun registering. At 4 hours, organ cascades would have initiated. By morning, the bioscan would have been reading a flatline, and the ship's medical officer would have filed a report about the tragic vulnerability of Earth's biological systems to the rich mineral content of Confederation cuisine. Instead, the bioscan read, sleeping human. Perfectly ordinary sleeping human. By the time Vekolar checked the readout at midnight, unable to sleep himself, Dorian Vasic's cellular structure showed no trace of chemical binding, no inflammatory cascade, no membrane degradation. The 157-di compound had, as far as the bioscan could determine, simply done nothing. Vekolar pressed 2 of his fingers against his primary forehead ridge, which was what his species did when they needed a moment to prevent themselves from making sounds that would wake the rest of the ship. He pulled up Dorian's personnel file, standard height and weight for an adult male human. No listed medical enhancements. No recorded chemical resistance modifications. Earth did not yet have access to the Confederation's biomedical augmentation technology, so that was not the explanation. No prior exposure to 157-bi or any related compound. No listed dietary anomalies beyond a noted preference for, and here the file used a transliterated Earth term, aggressively spiced food. Aggressively spiced food. Vekolar read the phrase twice. He pulled up Earth's dietary records, which the Confederation had catalogued as part of the standard species intake process. His 4 eyes moved slowly across the data. He reached the section on Earth cuisine. Then he kept reading. Then he stopped. He sat back. His species had a phrase for moments like this. Loosely translated, it meant, the universe has just told you something you were not ready to hear. Vekolar had always considered himself ready for most things. He had not been ready for the section on Vindaloo. He had not been ready for the entry on raw fermented shark. He had absolutely not been ready for the subsection titled, historically consumed substances later identified as toxic to most known life, which included a list of compounds that humans had not only ingested voluntarily across centuries but had, in several documented cases, built entire cultural traditions around, seasoning them, pairing them with beverages, and passing down the preparation methods as family heritage. Vekolar read for a long time. When he finally set down his tablet, his expression was one that his species reserved for very specific moments. Moments when the ground shifted, when the models broke, when everything you had built your professional confidence upon turned out to have been constructed next to a fault line you never thought to check. He had spent 43 rotations studying biological responses to toxins. He had never once studied humans. That, he understood now, had been a very significant oversight. Down the corridor, Dorian Vasic slept without interruption, his body humming along at 37.1 degrees, unbothered, untroubled, and faintly perhaps still thinking about the stew. By morning, Vekolar had 6 new research proposals drafted. By morning, Turasol had received his overnight report. By morning, every assumption the Confederation's Division of Interspecies Discretion had made about the quiet, uncomplicated removal of one Dorian Vasek had been revised, reconsidered, and quietly filed in the drawer marked, "We should have done more reading first." Dorian came to breakfast cheerful and punctual, greeted the kitchen staff by name, and asked if there was any of the stew left from the previous evening. There was not. "Shame," he said pleasantly. "I keep thinking about that spice." Turasol, who had not slept, watched him butter his bread with the serene competence of someone who had no idea he had survived something unsurvivable, and felt something she was not accustomed to feeling. It took her a moment to identify it. It was, she realized, fear, not of Dorian Vasek specifically, of how little she actually understood him. Turasol called an emergency meeting at the 6th hour of the ship's morning cycle, which was early enough that half the attendees arrived with their secondary eyelids still adjusting to the light. Vekolar was already seated when the others filed in. He had not slept. This was visible. He had, however, prepared a presentation, which was either a sign of professionalism or a sign that a person had spent the darkest hours of the night in a spiral of scientific humiliation and needed something structured to hold on to. Probably both. "The compound failed," Turasol said before anyone had fully sat down. She did not phrase it as a question. There was no point. The overnight bioscan data had already been distributed to the 4 senior staff members present, and they had all read it, and they were all currently performing the same careful act of pretending their faces looked normal. "The compound did not fail," Vekolar said. He pressed his fingers together on the table. The compound performed exactly as designed. The issue is that the subject's biology did not respond to it in any predicted manner. These are different problems. They produce the same result, said Commander Pelris Vaughn, the ship's tactical officer, who had the angular, skeptical face of someone who had seen many plans go wrong and had long ago stopped being surprised by it. They do, Vekolar admitted, but the distinction matters for what we do next. He activated the wall display. A rotating molecular diagram appeared, the 157 by compound, clean and precise. Its binding sequences highlighted in pale orange. I reviewed Earth's dietary records last night, he said. Comprehensive review, full catalog. He let that sit for a moment. Humans, he said, have been voluntarily consuming compounds chemically adjacent to 157 dice for approximately 3,000 years of their recorded history. They call the active agent capsaicin. It is found in a category of plants they named peppers. They have bred these plants over generations to produce increasingly elevated concentrations of the compound. They have competitions to determine who can consume the most extreme versions. They have developed a term for the physical distress response that consumption produces, which they describe as, and I am reading this directly from their cultural archive, a good burn. Silence. A good burn, Commander Pelris Vaughn repeated. They consider it pleasurable, Vekolar said. There are restaurants on Earth that specialize in escalating the intensity of this compound to levels that require signed acknowledgement forms. Customers sign forms agreeing to physical distress and then pay for the privilege. More silence. I also found, Vekolar continued with the composure of a man delivering a eulogy for his own career, that 157 Bex shares a secondary molecular structure with a compound found in a plant they call garlic, a compound in a root they call ginger, and a compound in a tree bark they have been grinding into powder and sprinkling on their food for thousands of years. They call it cinnamon. Turasol closed her eyes briefly. He said it tasted like cinnamon. She said, he said it tasted like cinnamon that had lost a fight with pepper. Vekolar corrected, with a precision that suggested this specific detail had been keeping him awake. Which is, chemically, a more accurate description of 157 by than anything in our own literature. Commander Pelris Vaughn leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling. He identified the compound by taste, not identified, not consciously, but his biology recognized it as food adjacent. His cellular systems categorized it as a known irritant class and processed it accordingly, the same way they process every meal he eats that, by our standards, should be inducing at minimum a moderate toxic response. The fourth person in the room, Medical Officer Saraveth, who had been quiet until now and who had the look of someone composing a very careful resignation letter in their head, spoke up. How much of what we serve aboard this ship would qualify as toxic to most standard species, by Earth baseline thresholds? Vekolar pulled up a secondary chart. Approximately 12% of our standard crew menu registers as a Category 2 irritant or above for human biology. Of that 12%, the human has consumed roughly 60% over the past 6 weeks, apparently with no side effects beyond occasional expressions of enthusiasm about the flavor. He told me our fermented grain appetizer was, quote, punchy in a good way, Saraveth said faintly. That appetizer contains a preserving compound that causes contact dermatitis and threlians, Vekolar said. He had 3. Nobody said anything for a moment. The question, Turasol said, steering the meeting back toward something resembling purpose, is where this leaves us. It was in fact several questions layered inside one. Where it left the plan, where it left their understanding of human biology, and most pressingly, where it left the fact that Dorian Vasek was currently somewhere on this ship, alive, cheerful, and probably asking someone an inconvenient question about something. We need more information, Vekolar said. I cannot design an effective approach without understanding the actual parameters of human biological tolerance. Everything I assumed was based on generalized mammalian models. Those models are wrong, or rather they are accurate for mammals. Humans are mammals who have spent several thousand years voluntarily stress testing those models and selecting generationally for the ones who survived the experiment. You're describing evolutionary toxin resistance, Saraveth said. I'm describing something that does not have a good name in our literature yet, Vekolar said. I may have to write a paper. You may have to write several, Saraveth said. I'm aware. Turasol folded her hands on the table. She was a diplomat before she was anything else. And diplomats were, at their core, people who had learned to take a situation that had gone wrong and find the next move inside it. The first move had failed. The subject was alive. Those were the facts. We proceed carefully, she said. No further attempts until we understand what we are actually dealing with. Vekolar, I want a full biological assessment. Discreet. Use the passive scanning array. He does not need to be aware. He will probably notice, Vekolar said. Why? Because he notices everything, Vekolar said, with a flatness that carried the weight of 6 weeks of accumulated observation. He noticed the fuel log irregularity on day 9. He noticed that Lieutenant Pravkaith was favoring her left side before the medical bay had flagged it. He told me last week that my atmospheric calibration in Lab 3 was reading 0.4 degrees high, which it was and which I had not yet discovered myself. He said it casually, Vekolar added, on the way to breakfast, as if he was mentioning the weather. Another silence. This one had a different texture to it. Less shock. More the particular exhaustion of people who are beginning to suspect that the problem they are dealing with is larger than the problem they thought they had. Proceed carefully, Turasol repeated, more quietly. That is all I can tell you. The meeting ended. They filed out. Vekolar stayed behind and looked at the molecular diagram on the wall for a long time after everyone else had gone. Dorian Vasek at that precise moment was in the ship's observation corridor on the upper deck, leaning against the curved transparent hull panel and looking out at the starfield with a cup of something hot in both hands. It was a beverage the kitchen staff had started making for him after he spent a week gently asking questions about their brewing methods and then offering a modification that, according to the crew, had significantly improved the base recipe. They had named it after him, informally. Among the maintenance crew it was called a Vasek morning cup. He did not know this. He would have been embarrassed if he did, and also quietly very pleased. He was thinking, as he often did in these quiet corridor hours, not about the stew for once, but about the memo. 40 pages. 2 weeks of off-hours work. A genuine attempt to offer something useful to a diplomatic framework that he could see from where he stood, had certain structural blind spots that were going to cause friction as more species entered the observation tier. He had written it carefully. He had cited precedents. He had been respectful. He had also been honest, because he was not very good at being respectful without also being honest, and he had long ago stopped pretending otherwise. No response. This did not particularly surprise him. He had been in enough rooms, on enough ships, in enough tense diplomatic corridors back on Earth to know that the people who most needed to hear a thing were often the last ones to acknowledge receiving it. But he had hoped. He sipped his drink. The stars outside were the particular cold white of deep travel, the ship moving at a speed that made the field look almost still, the way very fast motion sometimes fakes stillness. He had always liked that. The illusion of calm inside momentum. He heard footsteps. He recognized them without turning. Vekolar's secondary limb had a slightly uneven stride, barely perceptible, the result of an old injury if Dorian had to guess, though he had never asked. Morning, Dorian said. Vekolar stopped. He had clearly intended to pass through without engaging. He stood in the corridor for a moment with the specific discomfort of someone who has been caught doing something, which was strange because he had not been doing anything except walking. Good morning, Vekolar said carefully. Dorian turned and looked at him with the calm, open expression he wore when he was actually paying attention to something. You look terrible, he said. Did you sleep? I conducted extended research, Vekolar said. So no. Dorian turned back to the window. The stew from last night, he said, conversationally. The spice in it. Was that from a Confederation source or a trade port stock? I am asking because I have been trying to identify the base compound all morning and I keep landing on something in the aldehyde family which is interesting. Vekolar went very still. It's fine if it was a specialty import, Dorian continued, unbothered. I'm not complaining. I'm curious. There was a secondary flavor layer that I initially put down as mineral but I'm now thinking might have been synthetic, which makes it more impressive actually because synthetic flavor compounds that hit that kind of depth are genuinely hard to engineer. Vekolar stared at the side of Dorian's head. Dorian Vasek was standing at a corridor window drinking a morning beverage and casually reverse engineering the molecular composition of the compound that had been designed to kill him, framing it as idle intellectual curiosity about cuisine. I would have to check with the kitchen, Vekolar said. No rush. Dorian smiled into his cup. It's not important, just interesting. There was a pause. Outside the window, a small cluster of distant light shifted almost imperceptibly as the ship adjusted its heading. Can I ask you something? Dorian said. Of course, Vekolar said, with the tone of someone saying yes while every instinct screamed the opposite. Has the ambassador read my memo? Vekolar blinked. I am not privy to the ambassador's reading schedule. Fair. Dorian tapped the side of his cup. I ask because I think there are 1 or 2 sections that might have landed badly, and I want to address them before they calcify into a bad impression. There's a part in Section 7 where I used the phrase institutional inertia, which I meant descriptively and not as a criticism, but I have been told before that I do not always land the distinction. Vekolar looked at him for a long moment. This was the thing about Dorian Vasek that the personnel file did not capture. The file documented what he did. It did not document the quality of attention he brought to a room. The way he spoke to you as if your response actually mattered to him. The way he noticed things not to use them but because he was genuinely relentlessly interested in how everything worked. It was, Vekolar thought, profoundly inconvenient. I will mention to the ambassador that you are open to discussion, Vekolar said finally. Dorian looked at him with a mild, genuine surprise that suggested this was more than he had expected. That would be great, he said. Thank you. Vekolar nodded once and continued down the corridor, a little faster than necessary. Behind him, Dorian turned back to the window and finished his drink. He was not naive. He had worked in enough complex environments, with enough entities who smiled at him while calculating against him, to know when the temperature of a room was off. He had felt it at dinner the previous night. He had felt it for several days before that. Actually, a subtle shift in the social architecture of the ship that he could not trace to a specific event. He was not alarmed. He was, if anything, curious. People behaved oddly when they felt threatened. He had noticed this early and tracked it ever since. And the specific flavor of oddness he had been detecting aboard the Sovereign Pale lately was the kind that came not from aggression but from miscalculation, from people who had expected something to happen and were now quietly recalibrating because it had not. He had no idea what they had expected. But he found he wanted to understand it, not to defend himself, not to retaliate, to understand. Because understanding was, in his experience, almost always more useful than the alternative. He set down his empty cup on the ledge and rolled his right shoulder slowly, feeling the familiar complaint from the old injury, and then he walked toward the ambassador's quarters because he had a memo to follow up on, and because a day that started with good stew and honest conversation was, in his personal framework, a day worth pursuing. He knocked. After a longer pause than necessary, Turasol opened the door. She looked at him with an expression he had not seen on her face before. Not the controlled diplomatic neutrality. Not the specific mild irritation she usually wore in his presence. Something more complicated. More honest. Ambassador, he said pleasantly. I wondered if you had a few minutes to talk about Section 7. She looked at him for a long moment. Then, slowly, she stepped aside and gestured him in. It was not forgiveness. It was not trust. It was something smaller and more fragile than either of those. The beginning of the decision to try. Dorian walked in, sat down in the offered chair and waited with the easy patience of someone who had never once doubted that the conversation was worth having. Outside the viewport in Turasol's quarters, the stars held still in their ancient, indifferent positions, and the ship moved through them at a speed that looked from a distance almost like calm. Almost. Aboard the Sovereign Pale, in Lab 3, Vekolar opened a new research file. He titled it, Human Biological Tolerance, Initial Survey and Preliminary Implications. He stared at the blinking cursor for a moment. Then he added a subtitle, Why Everything We Thought We Knew Was a Starting Point, Not a Conclusion. He began to write. It would take him 3 rotations to finish the first draft. It would take the Galactic Confederation considerably longer to accept what it said. But that, as it turned out, was a very human kind of problem. And Dorian Vasek, who was currently explaining the nuances of graduated consensus thresholds to an ambassador who was, against all expectations, actually listening, would have told you the same thing. Some conversations take time. That does not mean they are not worth starting.
What would you have done in Vakolar's place? Let me know. Will you like and subscribe for more? See you next time.